Welcome to The Green Urbanist, the podcast that helps urbanists understand and act on climate change. I'm Ross. Today's episode is a conversation with Niall McEvoy. Niall is Business Development Manager at Scotscape, a leading green infrastructure and living wall provider. But this title doesn't really do him justice. Really, he's an educator and speaker with expertise in urban greening, horticulture, and the science behind how plants and trees can improve our cities. Niall leads training courses on the design, construction, and maintenance of living walls, provides continuing professional development programs for architects and designers globally, and regularly speaks on these subjects at industry events. In this episode, we talk in depth about air quality, biophilia, and biodiversity, and Niall explains how urban greening is essential to making cities more livable and sustainable. We also talk specifically about living walls, also known as green walls, about how they work and what some of the benefits of this approach are compared to traditional landscaping methods. We also talk about the economic benefits of urban greening. In this episode, there's a good mixture of general principles and detailed science. Niall firmly believes that you can't just plant anything, you have to plant the right species together for the right situation, and we go into a bit of detail on that. And if you like Irish accents, then this episode is definitely for you. I'll share some of Scotscape's beautiful living walls on my social media accounts. On Instagram, it's at GreenUrbanistPod, and on Twitter, it's at GreenUrbanPod. Thank you, and please enjoy my conversation with Niall. Welcome, Niall. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ross.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Let's just kick off, and maybe you can just tell us who you are. Tell us a bit about yourself. What's your background?
Well, my name's Niall McEvoy. I work for a company called Scotscape in the Smartscape division. And I suppose the term landscaper is probably a little bit outdated these days. We're urban greeners. So we bring, beneficial plants into the built environment. You could bring any old plant into the built environment, but that's not exactly urban greening. That's flower arranging. When we think about urban greening, every plant plays a job in society. We've got to figure out what that job is. But it's my job to encourage architects and designers and planners to put those plants in the correct place so they can be actually beneficial to the people, who occupy those spaces. We look at everything from green roofs to living walls, interior landscaping, potted plants, whatever it takes to bring that greenery into the built environment.
So are you a landscaper by training?
No. So, a very quick history lesson in my life. I left school in 98. I'd finished my Leaving Cert in Ireland. I wasn't really sure what to do. So I went through the normal process of growing up, just working. Didn't start into any career initially. I was lucky enough to travel. Got to travel around Australia. We came back in 2007. And Christmas 2007, we went to Costa Rica. And it was during that time, we spent 3.5 weeks practically camping in the jungle.
Wow. And
that literally changed my life. I came back and said, right, I used to construct tower cranes at the time. I don't want to construct tower cranes anymore. I want to build a jungle. How do you build a jungle? So I started into horticulture, done a 2-year certificate in Ireland doing gardening. It's quite hard to grow a jungle in Ireland because you haven't figured that out. So that was the first challenge. So with the recession looming in Ireland, things got bad, lots of jobs were lost. We got an opportunity to come over here to London, and I came over, which was around this time, 2011. By pure accident, I got a job with Scotscape, and I became maintenance manager for the living wall department all over a 4-month period. Then it just led me on to greening the urban jungle. So I couldn't create my actual jungle, so I settled for the urban jungle. So now, again, I teach architects, I teach designers, I teach town planners about the positive benefits about bringing green infrastructure into the built environment. I generally talk a lot about air pollution. We talk about biophilia, and that relates to people's mental health and their relationship with nature. And we talk about biodiversity, why it's important to give back to the planet. Like, we only get one shot, so we might as well make the most of it.
That's great. I mean, I think you touched on 3 really important points there that we can talk about maybe in turn a bit later on. This concept of urban greening is really interesting. And you said it's not just about planting anything.
No. And okay, well, to explain it, I have to explain about a particular topic. And that would kind of lead on to an air pollution topic because it would make sense. When we want to tackle a problem such as air pollution, we first have to understand the problem. And this is a very, very simplistic explanation, a very simplistic way to resolve a given issue. We could talk here all day and not actually draw a conclusion. And, we've got a limited amount of time. So when we think about air pollution, we're going to think about two types. One is a gas and one is a solid. Now, if we think about gases for a moment, we've got carbon. Let's just talk about carbon. There's multiple gases which will exist in the built environment, but carbon most people can relate to. It's going to cause the greenhouse effect and so on. And we have different types of plants. Even to narrow that down a little bit more simplistic, you can have an evergreen plant and a deciduous plant or a broadleaf plant. So generally speaking, a broadleaf plant can remove more gases from the air per day as a percentage as opposed to the evergreen. Okay. Except the broadleaf can only do it during the summer, during full leaf, where the evergreen can do it all year round, although to a lesser extent. So when we think about building air pollution barriers or protecting oneself, you would think about having the best broadleaves, the best evergreens to kind of create this all year round protection. Let's say wherever you are in the world listening to this podcast, if you could look out your window, you'll probably see a tree in the landscape. Most people have a perception, we see a tree, it's 100% alive. How does a tree get so big? We know it has leaves. We know it takes energy from the sun. It's called photosynthesis. Does that make the plant grow? We know plants put roots, very deep roots down into the ground. Do we believe that it sucks up all these nutrients and it mixes with the sun's energy and the plants kind of grow? To a certain extent. But to a larger extent is, you think of like an old vacuum cleaner. A couple of years ago, they had a vacuum bag, and the more dirt the vacuum sucked up, the bigger the bag became. Think of a tree in the same concept. The larger the tree you see in the landscape, the more carbon it would have absorbed during its lifetime. When you look at a tree, that tree by volume is probably only about 2, 3, 4% alive. The leaves are alive. The cambium, which is the internal of the bark, is alive, transports water. But everything else is trapped carbon. So we need more woody plants, the correct type of woody plants in the built environment to be able to absorb all of these gases. Forestry, I say with a sigh, we ruined the planet with forestry. To be fair, a tree gets into its stride at about 200 years old. Wow. That's when it's able to start really absorbing carbon. And the good thing about having ancient forests and ancient woodlands is a tree could grow for many hundreds of years. And let's say, for argument's sake, it naturally fell over. The wind, it blew it over. Over time, that tree would decompose, and all that carbon gets trapped into the ground, where it is also stored for many years. What we do these days is we allow trees to grow for 80 to 100 years. We send in large machinery, pumping carbon into the built environment, chop down all these trees, which are still as infants, to be hauled away. And then we repeat that process. So it's always degrading the amount of carbon we can actually absorb from the air. So when we think about the built environment, don't get me wrong, if I could plant acres and acres and acres of forest, which I know are going to be there for hundreds of years, which would be hugely positive, and the UK actually has to lose some land to agriculture, and it does actually have to put it over to forestry. I think it's about 4%, and you have to do this over the next 30, 40 years. So we are also on a mission to bring more of these type of plants into the built environment. When we think about solids, what is a solid? Well, a solid is, the correct name is a particulate. And a particulate could be anything, just really, really, really small. Okay. So some of the leading causes of particulates in the built environment would be brake discs, car tires. We say, we changed them due to wear and tear. Where does that wear and tear go? It doesn't vanish. It has to go somewhere. When you open your dryer and you take the lint drawer out from your clothes, even after a wash, you see an amount of lint has built up. The square mile of London drops 2 billion fibres per day. So then we're going to give particulates, we're going to scale them in sizes. So you may, if you just look at some news reports, you'll see PM10s, PM2.5s, PM1s. What does that mean? Well, 10 relates to the size of the particle. A PM10 is 10 microns or 10 micrometers in diameter. To give that scale, if I took a human hair and split it 5 ways, we have the size of a PM10. The PM2.5, 20 times smaller than the width of a hair. PM1's 50 times smaller than the width of a hair. How does that affect us? Well, as we breathe in, we've got hairs in our nose, not just decoration. It's there to perform a function. That function is to help us filter the air as we breathe in. PM2.5s are so small they'll navigate your body's natural line of defense. That causes premature aging of the lung. PM1s can enter your bloodstream and they can constrict even the arteries and can clot your blood. This has contributed to air pollution being one of the leading causes of heart attack in the UK. Air pollution kills about 40,000 people year in, year out, but we don't see that as a pandemic. So we know 2 problems. One is a gas, one is a solid. So how are we going to fix these problems? If we can bring in more, obviously a huge solution is reduce the amount of vehicles, emissions, etc., etc., etc. That's the most logical thing you can do.
But as you said, with brake discs and tires, you're still, even if you switch to electric cars, you still have that problem.
Well, the problem is if you switch to electric cars, particulates become more so because electric cars are generally heavier than combustion engines, so more pressure is put on brake discs and car tires. Now, to give everything perspective, we've talked about, say, sulfur dioxide. 15 of the world's largest ships are the equivalent of every other vehicle on the planet combined in 1 year's amount of emissions. So by you purchasing a new phone, a new laptop, anything that is on a shipped, let's say for argument's sake, a Samsung phone which is shipped around the world, that contributes to emissions as well, even more so than just traffic on the street. So emissions are coming. This is why I said this is a very simplistic solution to a very complex problem.
Well, I think this is a great point. I mean, I've said before in previous episodes that it's not just about carbon, and that even if you reduce carbon emissions to 0, we still have to live with other problems like the PM10s, PM2.5s, and in fact we could even make them worse because through other ways. So you really have to take a big, high-level, holistic view of this.
For me, as we discussed earlier before we started this recording, lockdown was wonderful, and I think for some people to put perspective, what's important and what maybe isn't as important as they once perceived it to be. And it would be great if people could carry on that mindset. When we were in lockdown, we physically could not go to the shops to spend our money. And life went on regardless. We didn't need to buy all of these things. And it would be great if, I know not everyone will agree with what I say, but it'd be great if some people could still hold those values true. You don't need everything you see just because you have money in your pocket to buy it. It does have a larger expense. And
I'm sure for me, the things that have brought me the most joy and the most relief during this period has been going out into nature. We went camping last weekend, and that was like taking a bath. It was like washing away the urbanity.
Yeah, there is a name for it. The Japanese call it forest bathing.
Yeah,
forest.
Exactly,
I can't look. I would do it an injustice to try and pronounce the correct word. But it is a very real thing. It does affect your mental health. It does affect your nervous systems. As part of your nervous system, there's multiple areas, and I'm going to focus on 2 very quickly. There's the sympathetic part of your brain. There's the parasympathetic part of your brain. Sympathetic part of your brain controls cognitive function. It will also wake you up in the morning, get you going for the day. And it makes you. If we overload this side of your brain, we call this generally the fight or flight mode, and our brain will generally turn to stress. Now, stress is a warning sign for your body. It only becomes a negative thing when we don't listen to our own bodies. And we will reject. And this can come in many ways. For lots of people, for me, when you're trying to work at home during lockdown with children, I'd have the audio of kids in the background, which is quite off-putting. And it can be generally an overload. You generally feel like you can't focus. For people who live in the built environment, if they have a grey view, which is lots of concrete and railings and buildings and whatnots, this can be quite damaging to your mental health. Yeah. On the flip side, the parasympathetic part of your brain, this deals with rest and digestion. This is the side of the brain which reacts to nature. And long story short is that they put people, it was Terrapin Bright Green in the States, and they put people into big ECG machines and they monitored brainwaves. And what they discovered is when people are exposed to nature imageries, even pictures, imageries of nature, trees, plants, shrubs, walking in the forest, walking in the park, hanging out with your friends and playing sports to a certain degree will satisfy this side of your brain. Humans are creatures of comfort. We love to be rewarded, and our brains will reward us. And this shows where our relationship with nature came. We talk about biophilia. That means bio is life and philia, love of. And that's a very, very old word. And it just rings true. And like you said about camping, we go camping quite frequently with the kids. And I know this sounds a bit cheesy, but the last time we were camping, I was walking back to the car just to get some more bits and bobs. And I remember just taking a moment going, it's like, I know it sounds cringy, but it was like your battery's recharging.
Yeah.
You know, because I was away from everything else. I had no phone signal. It was wonderful. No internet. And it was peace and quiet, you know? And it literally felt like your batteries were being recharged so you could go back to work and, you know, have your focus and have whatnot. So I know it rings true because I personally experienced it. I know actually a lot of my life decisions, you know, when I've made those key decisions or what put me on that track, it was probably in the forest or in the jungle or somewhere green, which kind of, you know, it gave me direction, I guess. Now, it's not to say that, you know, if your cat died tomorrow, a bunch of flowers is going to make you laugh. But there does ring true that we are elements of nature ourselves. And every day we should be exposed and we should be immersed with nature.
And it's the biophilia element is not just visual, is it? I mean, one of my best memories from camping last year in a particular campsite, which was very kind of forested around it. And we had a really bright sunny morning at about 5 a.m. We had the dawn chorus of the just incredible amounts of birds all singing together. And it was really like a symphony. Yeah. And it was also slightly annoying because I was trying to sleep. Yeah. But an incredible experience. In London, in East London here, we're fairly central. We just get a few kind of belligerent seagulls. Not really the same experience.
No. But still, if it was silent, if it was dead silent, you would miss it.
Yes.
The thing is, we don't understand a lot until it's gone.
Yeah.
So look, where I grew up in Ireland, I'm 40 now. So where we grew up in Ireland was a small village, and it was 3 miles outside a local town. And if we drove into the town on a warm summer's evening, what would you expect to find in your windscreen? Insects. Yeah. Well, granted, dead insects.
Yeah.
And I remember distinctly going into a garage with my father, and you could buy this spray for your windscreen. I think it was something like Bug Off or something like this. And it was basically for, you know, cleaning the guts off your windscreen. But it was, the amount of life was there. It was incredible. I done a trip to Wales. It was a year ago. 500 miles return trip, 2 insects on the screen.
Oh my God.
So they call this the windscreen phenomena. Now, Germany had monitored 68 sites over the last 30 years and had a decline of 76% of all winged insects. So the thing is, you talk about the chorus or even having the birds, we're killing everything at an alarming rate. And when it's gone, you know, that's when it's going to be truly missed. And we do have the opportunity to reclaim everything. Everything is not lost. We just have to make conscious decisions about what we do and how we do it and literally when we're going to do it.
Yeah.
You know, and we can't look at everything as just... There's a huge amount of benefits for green infrastructure. So whether it's social... But we leave all those ones. Let's just talk about one, the economics. Some people think that adding greenery into the built environment is a waste of money, and there's a huge argument and lots of evidence to show it is absolutely not a waste of money. The one thing that is harder for people to get around, the economics of biodiversity. So obviously, the number one thing is here, we're harming our own planet. You know, this is our home, you're harming your own home. But people are struggling to see beyond this. You know, what's the point in adding in some of these pollinating plants? What's the economic effects to me? Well, you know, sometimes that answer isn't there in your face. Where I could say I could put a living wall up, you could have an insulating value to your house and you can make instant money. Where I could say that air pollution harms the UK economy by £17 billion per year. And if we can reduce that figure, that obviously we can have more money in our pocket. But then what's the value of putting in more pollinating plants and whatnot when you don't think outside the box? You know, obviously we need more pollinating plants to pollinate the plants so we can have food and so on, and we can exist. But it's trying to get lots of people to understand that as a simple value that we need to bring.
I would say in terms of the economics, there's been plenty of studies done over the years on the uplift in property values when a property is located near a park, and also when there's street trees outside. So that's very well kind of accepted. It's just a matter of communicating that, isn't it? When people say, oh, I don't want trees in my development because then I have to pay someone to clean up the leaves when they fall. You say, well, you're probably losing out on money then. If you...
Well, like it's Grosvenor State's done a study, and like Grosvenor being the biggest landowner in the world, and if they're going to do a study about property, you generally listen. But they took two identical houses, for argument's sake, Street A and Street B. Street A has access to trees, shrubs and plants and whatnot, and Street B does not. Street A will sell for 11.2% more than Street B just because it has access to nature.
That's significant.
It is hugely significant. And we, you know, it's the economics of biophilia. Okay, we'll give it another description. Imagine you are going off to buy an apartment, and you can look at two properties. Again, one is the big block of flats, and you know, I don't want to name any builders. I'm not picking on anyone. Let's just, for argument's sake, we'll call them ABC Construction. For argument, we won't hurt anyone's ego. ABC Construction have built a block of apartments. Now they have a choice. They could just, hey, let's put in a big car park. Everyone gets 2 car park spaces. Very convenient. There's a little bus going to come in. You know, we'll make it really accessible or whatnot. Or they might decide to say, hey, let's put in landscape gardens. We'll put in a little water feature and we'll make it so on. What do you generally find? More so than not, because when I look around, most big apartment blocks, they generally have some green space. Generally do, especially the newer developments. I look out at Kidbrooke Village. Kidbrooke Village is fantastic, wildflower meadows, the ponds, everything out there. People should really check that one out. But why do developers go to this end? Well, they're ultimately dressing the building because they're trying to sell that dream that you're young, that you might want to start a family. When you buy the home, you're buying the entire package. It's not just the property itself. So they can see the power, the relationship, the economics attached to attaching greenery to any particular building. We have companies like Condell. Condell are the most wonderful engineering company that I've ever met, especially the guys up at St. Paul's. At the time, they had the only WELL-certified building in Europe. Now, for anyone who isn't familiar with the WELL building standard, it's an American building practice. I won't go into details, but you can download WELL for free. You can implement 70% of it for free. So take all the benefits. You don't actually have to put your hand in your pocket. When Condell moved from their old office to their new WELL-certified office, and the results were astronomical. Everything up from a sense of community, a sense of a workplace, how they work, productivity, everything went up like 30, 40, 50% productivity. The huge amount was saved. People were less absent from work. They actually saved £90,000 from people being less absent from work. Because staff turnover was also down, they saved an additional £120,000. There was £210,000 saved because their office extended beyond biophilia even, because they did look after all the air, the water, the amount of VOCs present in any of the furniture, etc., etc. When you walk in their main door, their canteen is right there. And they actually done a little experiment unknown to the staff. They dressed some of the tables with extra plants and extra foliage and made them look extra pretty. Those tables were rammed with people, like too many people sitting at this one little table and all these empty desks behind them, just to prove to themselves. There is a huge magnetic draw for humans and to have nature in their life. There's actually, and I can't wait for the study to come out. I listened to, it was a radio show in Ireland, and there was 2 guys in Trinity College. They were studying areas of high biomorphic design. that's when architecture will mimic nature.
Oh, I see.
And they were saying that crime rates, like, because it affects us socially, crime rates can actually drop up to 53%.
Wow.
Which is actually phenomenal. So when we think about making areas biophilic, and we've probably spoke all of today was more about workplaces and the economics and the so on and so forth. But we think about socially. If you can reduce stress on people, now look, don't get me wrong. If something tragic happened, it's not going to cheer your mood up, to a huge degree. But it's that arch of people just generally feel happier and more content within their place. If people are happier, more content, that's where you'll see the reducing stress, the reducing crime, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's not about the extreme stress. It's about that underlying stress that we all feel.
Or it's having your little escape, Like I live near Blackheath, and I can escape down to Greenwich Park. I went for a walk yesterday down to Greenwich Park. There was a full-blown orchestra in the middle of the park, and it was just completely out of the blue in a little grove of trees. I'd say there must have been 40 musicians and probably another 50 people just sitting on the grass. And I was like, wow, like this is phenomenal. So I sat down with them.
That's how you know it's a royal park.
But yeah, we all need those escapes. But if we could have our escapes, some people are more fortunate than others that maybe they have access to parks on a very short walk or short cycle. It'd be a shame that you have to do the majority of your walk just to get to that park. So when we speak in general about green infrastructure, about bringing greenery to street level, we just want to make the most of the space which exists. We think about London. We think about London being a hive of life, any city being a hive of life. However, you remove the humans, where's that life?
Yes.
It's probably one of the most sterile places on the planet when you really actually boil down to diversity with all the different types of birds and animals and humans and whatnot. So urban greening is about bringing nature and greenery to people's lives, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's in their homes, whether that's socially, that they have a place to access. I don't know if we've said it earlier, but 10% of UK households have no access to public or private spaces, which is tragic. And where do you escape to?
It's part of our responsibility, I think, as urbanists, if you're a planner or an architect, to consider these things and think of it as a basic human right.
Well, I think so. Well, this could actually further the conversation to where and how should future developments be led? Because it was always, landscaping was the poor relation, which was always the one which was cost engineered out at the end of a project, which the client may have started off with great expectations. At the end of the project, it turns out traditional car park planting, not inspired. It's actually worse. For me, it does more damage. There's a new Aldi near us. Is it even open a year? I don't think it is. And car park planting, it looks terrible. Yeah. Already it looks terrible. Depressing. So it's like a waste of money. So what's the next step? Should we now look at developments like from an architecture, from a planning stage, and go, how can we house X amount of people and make it extremely biophilic, that we can and become sustainable and resilient throughout the ages, that we're not just going to have a load of plants in that are hugely expensive to run on maintenance costs, to use a dreadful amount of water, it wasn't well thought out, etc., etc., etc. Like, we've designed living wall systems, rainwater harvesting, recirculating systems. So we captured all the rainfall off the roof of the building. It went to our irrigation tank. From there, we pumped it through the living wall. Rather than it going to waste, we collected all that water, we cleaned it, we oxygenated, and we can reuse it over and over and over.
That's great.
There is a freshwater top-up should it ever be needed, but hopefully, it's never needed. And if we look at other countries, China's Forest City project, where you could take a blank canvas of land and plan for the future. Now, the Forest City project is to house 30,000 people, but if you go on to, it's due to open next year, but anyone could Google it now, see some Google images. It's bowled over with plants, because they have given up a ratio of land to nature, to satisfy our needs. And, when you do that correctly, you can link up water systems into plant root systems. So rather than water hitting stormwater drains, for argument's sake, it goes into a tree pit. Those trees can absorb all that water, etc., etc. So it's about being able to use infrastructure. We have these words, green infrastructure. Eventually will be just part of the norm. But we should be able to use all of these ideas so one can satisfy the other.
Green infrastructure is just another type of infrastructure.
Yeah.
That we should think about the same way as drainage and electricity.
Absolutely. And again, we'll probably drop the word green in the future. It'll just become the norm. It becomes very logical and cost effective that's the way we do. This is our planet. These are our plants. This is where we live. It'll just become the normal.
This project in China, I'm blanking on the name of the architect. I think it's led by the same architects who designed Bosco Verticale in Milan, which is become a bit of a poster boy for this sort of vertical greening. It's basically 2 skyscrapers, residential buildings, which are totally ringed by actual trees. So they're not just green walls, they're actual trees that are sort of attached onto the building. And when I saw it in Milan in real life, I thought this looks like a CGI because it's so stunningly beautiful. Something I think we can talk about living walls more specifically, but something I'd love to get back to is this idea that you can't just plant any old plant and it'll do the same thing. Different plants have specific roles and also they work together as a system.
I touched on this earlier when I said about broadleaf trees and evergreen trees removing gases from the air and so on. And we need more woody plants. And I mentioned about a solid, I mentioned about PM10 and about the size and how it can affect our bodies. Now, if you think about a broadleaf tree, for argument's sake, will have a leaf the size of your hand. Right? That's a big old leaf. And if you think about a particulate, where a particulate could be 1/20th the width of a human hair, you certainly have a David Goliath type situation. This monstrous beast of a leaf and this tiny little dot as a particulate. So physics is going to play its role. So as the air carries these particulates through the air pressure is going to hit the leaf, and it will prevent that particulate from physically really hitting the leaf to any great value. Instead, it will deflect. It'll go around that particular plant. So when we think about urban greening, again, with correct foliage, a better type of leaf structure would be similar to a pine tree, a conifer. So you have lots of needles, lots of leaves. They're numerous, but they're all very small. And in a living wall scenario, this might be like a heather, or a type of grass, or you can put in little dwarf conifer trees as well. So as air pressure, as wind hits these type of plants, it doesn't deflect off too easily. Instead, air will pass through and around the needles. That's going to help diffuse the air. It's going to slow everything down. If we can slow everything down, we can stick in some companion plants. Now, the best one to describe is a stachie. Some people know it as the lamb's ear. And if I had one here and I said, Ross, describe it in like a word, chances are you would say it feels like velvet. Because it does. It feels like velvet. But if you looked at those hairs under a microscope, actually, they're not straight. They actually have a barb-like structure. So when we can pass air through one type of plant, we can slow everything down. We can stick in companion plants. We can trap and hold these particulates onto the leaf. When the rain comes, wash everything down to ground level. So this, again, just goes back about tailoring the correct plants for the correct type of situation. A different type of air pollution barrier would be if you had a road and then you had some, like a hedge, and then the pavement for people who are going to walk. That type of plant would want to have a really big leaf, like a laurel, a griselinia, bay. So this type is going to act like a barrier. So as air current hits these types of leaves, it kind of pushes everything back. Now, those type of leaves also have a waxiness, a stickiness to the leaf, and particles can be physically embedded, but it also acts as a physical barrier. With the living wall, so if you had roadside pavement and then living wall on a building, that's where we use more deposition type methods. That's where the stachys, the grasses, the pine trees. So they're going to try and trap and hold on particulates. So urban greening should be able to give you the best solution, rather than just trying to fly one flag. We do living walls, put living walls everywhere. That's great, but it might not be the best answer for a particular type of problem. You know, it might be that we need ivy screens or hedgerows or whatever the case may be. I'm just making up stuff. But so it's about knowing the correct type of plant and the correct method of installing these plants, because a living wall is just a method. People say, living walls are great, and living walls are great, but a living wall is just the method. It's the plants which are the beneficial element. Now, some living walls are better than others in terms of construction or cost even, or accessibility, and how they promote plant health. So the system we worked on, we actually spent a lot of time trying to develop a system which was beneficial to plant health. Then we figured out how do we attach it to a wall. A huge proportion of living wall systems out there are just systems which can attach to a wall and have the ability that we can put a plant in.
Okay.
So they're not all the same. It's like trying to compare a car and a bicycle. Both would get you from A to B. One just gets you there in comfort and style and, worries about everything. And the other one...
And the other one's a car.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, we just have many things to consider then in terms of planting for air pollution as well.
This is great. I mean, this reminds me of permaculture principles.
Yeah.
Is this idea that you don't just plant one monoculture and expect it to do everything. All the plants work together as a system. And we need to sort of understand that complexity rather than trying to distill nature down to individual elements.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people use moss as a good air quality plant.
Okay, yeah, moss is good. Now, moss is similar like the stachy and the whatnot. It's very small and whatever. This could be controversial. There's another moss system which meant to, the equivalent of 275 trees. I wouldn't believe everything I read. I believe it cleans the air within 10 mil of the structure and doesn't do much for the greater good of the street. So I'd just be mindful. Okay. I'd be mindful. Because we had to go and develop a system which had a really large pocket. So if you think of our standard living wall system has a pocket roughly, if you put your two hands together to make a fist, one finger interlinked, that's roughly the size of our living wall pockets. The much larger tree type walls basically is from my knuckles to just shy of my elbow.
Okay.
That allows in really big shrubs or really small trees. So in that living wall which we had done, we had 9 varieties of tree. Now, we didn't put birch in. We probably won't use birch in the real world because birch just grows too fast.
Okay.
But the hugely positive thing about this was that and this only became known afterwards, we created topography on the wall. So we had huge differences, ins and outs. So when we have all this protrusion of foliage off the wall, as air currents come up below that wall, it hits this protruding foliage, it creates turbulence. So the air is naturally slowed down. And then we stick in all our correct type of foliage as well with the smaller leaves and the hairs and all the so ons. So we have to use lots of logic and theories and whatnot and science. We call on people like Dr. Ross Cameron of Sheffield University can help guide us with the correct type of plants for trapping particulates. But when you see a living wall out in the built environment, I would love to think that every living wall has been put up with a true purpose in mind, and that for me, I will always drive home the air pollution or the biodiverse purpose. We will always take biophilic effects from it, but we'd have purpose for either of those methods. Unfortunately, we see lots of living walls out there which are probably just done for aesthetic reasons. They were just easy plants, bulletproof plants. You'll see some companies will always just do the same planting list over and over again religiously. And they should really experiment and try to be more adaptive. If you're going to be greening the built environment, people are going to look to you for guidance, and they should be, trying their best. Sometimes it won't be successful, but maybe have a little trial. Have a little trial in the small corner and see how it does perform. Like some of the best air cleaning plants, Pinus nigra, a wonderful air cleaning plant, big tree, but does not do well with air pollution. It actually kills it kills the tree ultimately after a short period of time. Pinus mungo is not the best air cleaning plant, but it's the best plant able to deal with air pollution. If that makes sense. Yeah. And the good thing about Pinus mungo is that after 50 years, it only grows about as tall as your hip. So it's an easy plant. It's a woody pine plant, which we can incorporate into a large pocketed living wall system. It will grow very slow, but it has the correct type of foliage, which is going to be beneficial for air pollution. And, then animals, birds and whatnot can use those woody plants for habitat. You get a solid footing for nesting and whatnot.
I guess the question about the living walls is obviously they're beautiful, and obviously they're, the whole purpose is that you can put plants not on a horizontal surface, but on a vertical surface. But in terms of these benefits and air quality and biodiversity, why not just plant a tree or traditional landscaping? What's the benefit of going down the living wall route?
The benefit is, okay, I'm a firm believer as we built what we thought we require at the time. Retrospect said, maybe we could have done it a different way.
You mean in terms of our cities, the way our cities are designed?
The way they've been originally planned. Because if that's why I'd urge people to have a look at China's Forest City project. And the same architect, Mexico's Forest City project.
Yeah.
So now they've taken everything which we have learnt and they can plan for the future. The reason we can't include trees into the built environment as easy as we want is... okay, I'll use this as an example. Putney High Street here in London. It was one of the most polluted high streets in the country. So they were given a grant, £50,000, to line the high street with trees. So they carried out a survey. Do you know how many trees they planted?
How many?
0.
It was just not possible.
Not possible. Too many services underneath. Where's your Wi-Fi? Where's your plumbing? Your electricity? It's all under the paving.
Yeah.
And then look at the actual width of the paving itself. Do you know why over the last 5 years Newcastle has chopped down 8,500 trees? Oof. Now there was a big controversy in Sheffield. They had planned to chop down 17,000 trees. They've cut down 3.5 to date. And these are all average figures. And do you know how much London was over the last 5-6 years?
How many?
49,000.
Really?
Uh-huh.
I had no idea the scale of it.
Right, well, Bristol's maintenance budgets were slashed like 53%. So if a tree got a pest or disease and that branch fell on people, on cars, and caused damage, wrong plants, wrong place, cherry trees been planted at street level and they've upturned pavements. I live down in Greenwich and you'll see trees planted too close to the road. So half the tree is growing in on top of people on the pavement and the other half is just dead flat from buses and lorries which go up and down every day and they've just taken foot. So these are all the wrong plants in the wrong place. We just planted them thinking, hey, we're great at planting loads of trees. But no, they were just terrible ideas. So councils are actually removing these from street level. So that's where the living wall will play its trump card, that we can take up an incredibly small amount of space. We can insulate the building, incredible for sound attenuation. Right. We can help control the heat island effect. I said, physical insulation on the building, and then you can include all the best plans for air pollution and biodiversity and so on. But, again, just to be in London again, do you know the city of Westminster in London houses 11,000 grade 2 listed buildings?
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, so they're all untouchable.
Of course, yeah.
Because they're grade 2. Now, look, I'm still believe in heritage, but I believe that we should live in the real world and some of those buildings should be allowed to be touched. Others, obviously leave them the way they are. So as all these trees were been removed from the built environment and as we can't green so many buildings these days, so we came up with this concept called living pillar. So living pillar was the idea to bring greenery to street level, and that was by applying a living wall system around a light column.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So
a totally unused resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're everywhere. The infrastructure already exists. So we put a reservoir at the base and still above head height, and our living wall system can be attached. It's all compression fit. It doesn't damage the lamppost at all. But they're solar powered. So solar power charges a battery which activates a pump which pumps the water around in a closed loop system. Then let's take a street. We'll take 2 streets for argument's sake. Let's say you've got 2 parks, Park A and Park B. That road which connects those parks, you could have the best native biodiversity plants linking those 2 parks, so you create a biodiversity road effectively. Okay. Yeah. So if you drove up to Scotland, what would you expect to find on the road? A service station. You need to refuel yourself and the car. Insects need the same. So these are little feeding stations to help birds and insects get from A to B. If it was on a very busy street, we'll put in all the best plants which are going to trap nitric oxide, carbon dioxide, PM10s, PM2.5s, and so on. Now, we're not saying that one pillar, like one tree, will revolutionize the entire built environment, but it's that collective effort.
It's cumulative,
if we can start to green up everywhere. And the best thing about these is we could easily remove them if necessary. We've helped develop this thing called an early sensor. So the end user, the client, will be able to log into a dashboard. They get in real time all the particulates present in the air, and it's a traffic light system. It'll show you when it's good, when it's bad. The same with all these gases. And it'll also forecast air pollution levels for the oncoming days. So if a school had one of these installed and they could monitor the playground and so on, they would know when air pollution levels spike, and maybe they could tailor the break times around the spikes in air pollution. So it's going to be bad regardless, but it could have been worse without knowing that sort of data as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much that goes in. I have an app on my phone that tells me what the air pollution is like in London at lots of different sensors, and it seems it's so dependent on whether it's windy, whether there's a construction site outside, whether there's obviously peak times when there's traffic.
You say construction site. Do you know how much one excavator is the equivalent of 15 double-decker buses?
What you mean when you're pulling up the foundations? And stuff like that?
Well, like a big digger. One excavator is the equivalent of 15 double-decker buses.
Just the fuel that they use?
For the amount of particulates and whatnot in the air. So if you see a site with maybe 10 excavators...
Oh my God. It's scary to think of.
It is scary to think about. It is. And then we look around the built environment and it's just constantly one building site after another.
I love this idea of finding any surface that is... untouched and making it green. So we've had green roofs for many years. I don't know if you do green roofs.
We did, but there's so many green roofers on the market. We just let them do it.
There's enough people covering that.
Yeah, we don't need that.
And obviously you're very pioneering in sort of the living walls. You've got the living pillars. What else is there we can cover?
Well, we've touched on it already, and I won't go into it too much, but green internal landscaping. Internal landscape is huge, because as people recognize all the biophilic effects and all. I won't touch on it too long, but we're developing one property over in Ireland. The building itself is 420,000 square meters, and they want interior parks.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is something we have a wonderful design team, and they've been working on this project and still will be working on it. It's like a 3-year project just from design point of view, and we'll worry about the water, the lights, the everything within that.
Just for the listeners, I can make a little plug here because I had Julia Murray, who's a well AP, the well building standard that we talked about earlier. I had her on the podcast a few episodes ago where we talked a lot about indoor air quality. So if you're interested in that, this is a good segue. But finish listening to this episode and then go listen to that one.
So another innovation which we'd worked on, and there's actually kind of a tragic story behind this. So did you know plants generate electricity?
Yeah. I've heard about the science project with the potato. Potato alarm clock.
Yeah. So we and lots of companies around the world have developed on, but we worked with Cambridge University and we installed a living wall with a carbon fibre layer in the middle. We put the living wall up as per normal. Cambridge came along and they were definitely the brains in this situation. They stuck little probes into every pocket, wired all the pockets together, and we planted up the living wall as per normal. When these plants are taking energy from the sun, photosynthesis happens. As a result, there's a bacteria at the root system. That bacteria produces positive and negative electrons. Because we now have an anode and a cathode in the living wall system, we're able to pull all the positive electrons out of the soil, feed it back to a battery pack. So the living wall at Cambridge Botanical Gardens was able to power the lights and the radio in this mock bush shelter. The tragic part of this entire story is the rights to that technology are owned by Cambridge and another Dutch university, and from what I've heard, that's locked in some cupboard in Cambridge's offices somewhere, because now they've moved on to new academic studies about algae and oil and all the rest. And wouldn't that have been wonderful to bring? Because I always thought it would be a wonderful idea that if we could create these little benches, how would I describe it? Imagine Imagine like a figure of 8. Okay, but we had an entrance at the top and the bottom. Okay. And there were living walls, effectively. So you were walking along, you just want a bit of peace and quiet. You could pop into your little pod. These living walls here are just generating electricity from photosynthesis. You could plug in your phone, have a little recharge, have a little workstation, or they just produce enough energy so it becomes self-sustaining. You know, we're not going to revolutionize the entire world, but I just thought that would have been a really great where you could blend in technology and you could blend in plants together. So people, you know, because I grew up in the countryside, and it wasn't until I came to the big bad city and then realized, I want to be back in the countryside. But there's plenty of other kids who don't share the same passions we do, and that's absolutely fine. But if you could make them interact, you know, with even using technology and planting as well, even if it was just simply to charge your phone, I just thought that would have been a wonderful idea. But it's probably just a little pipe dream.
Well, it segues nicely into another question I had, which was, obviously living walls have their own sort of irrigation system, which requires electricity. Yeah. And if you use them, if you have an indoor living wall, you need, sometimes you need growing lights.
We do.
So I guess the question is, how energy intensive are they?
Okay, I can only answer that question up to a point. So the lights are LED lights now, so they are all energy efficient to a certain point. For me to physically put a number on it right now, it's X amount. I can't. And the variation of living wall will depend. But if people want to understand why are lights even important? So if we bring it back a little bit, we have this massive broad spectrum of wavelengths. Short wavelengths, you'd have X-rays and cosmic rays and ultraviolet light. See, insects, they see an ultraviolet light. Like, not everything sees the same way as we see. Like, on the longer wavelength, you'd have your more broadcast wavelengths, you'd have your radio waves, radar, and so on. And there's a little tiny band in the middle, and we call this the visible spectrum, and that's what we see. And that'll range between 350 to 750 on this bandwidth. And when people make lights, let's say for argument's sake, the lights in this apartment are made by Philips, for argument's sake. When Philips made that light, they're going to make that light to suit the human eye, and that's going to peak about 600. What plants want is this broader spectrum, and we're going to pick up all, effectively, the colours of the rainbow, which is going to help photosynthesize, and they all play their different strengths. This is very simplistic. So when we go into any interior space, and we will have to know about lights, there's no point us installing plants if they're not going to actually successfully grow. So we would bring in this special light meter. It disregards all the wavelengths except for the visible spectrum. And it tells me how many photons hit a particular area. And when we can, so if I measured outside in reasonably good sun, I would get, it'd show about 1,300 micromoles. Okay. In an interior, my kitchen is north facing and we're a basement apartment. At the window, it gets about 8. And once I come back about a foot, it goes to about 1.5.
Oh my God, down from over 1,000.
Over 1,000 outside. Yeah.
Incredible.
So that's the difference between full sun to being heavy shade. So I can get the most shade loving plants to grow. I have a little shelf beside the window and they can happily grow there. There is a mount from your lamp, your lights, which we have overhead, there will be amount of photosynthetical active radiation produced from that light. But because this light was not designed to have a broad spectrum, only a very narrow spectrum to suit the human eye, there's only a certain amount of radiation a plant can extract from those lights. So when we're thinking about office places, it's the same. So we will go in with these light meters. We don't always want to put lights in if it's not necessary.
Of course,
So when we install their features, we would have to come along with this light meter. It will tell us the amount of light available. Then we can carry out a lighting survey, and then we can put in the appropriate amount of lights. And plants need sleep as well. We had one architect who picked his own lights, installed his own lights, etc., kept them on 24 hours a day, thinking this will be the best thing ever. And all these plants were failing, and we couldn't work this out for ages because we were only there during working hours. You know, let's say we arrive 10 o'clock in the morning time every 2 to 3 weeks. And we're like, why are these plants failing? And then he said it, well, the lights are on all the time. I don't know what's wrong. And we said, well, there's your problem. You're stressing the plants out. The plants need sleep. So, again, based on an apartment, I have terrariums at home. So a little jungle inside a box. And I have a small little grow light there. But it comes on 8 o'clock in the morning. It shuts off at 9 o'clock 10 o'clock every night.
Okay.
And then the plants sleep in between. So, as grow lights develop, they are become more efficient. Again, it's all LED lights. A couple of years ago, it used to be high pressure sodium lights, like you would see with the big hood and the big ballast block that you'd see in a greenhouse or in some person's attic,
Depending what they're growing.
I made that joke going into college, horticultural college. I was the only one who laughed. Everyone else looked at me going, "Are you one of those people?" But yeah, as lights improve, they are becoming more energy efficient to run. Because I know what you're saying. There's no point in having exorbitant electricity bills and wasting all this energy to promote X amount of growth. Like the ultimate aim is that if we start get people to switch to solar power, and then everything does become more sustainable. And urban farming, again, that will be a huge treasure chest when people really get to grips with urban farming, because one, we can create local jobs, local farmers, and two is the air miles. It's tragic. It's tragic that we can actually buy strawberries at Christmas.
Yes, the
Absolutely. Air miles attached to that food. You can trick plants into growing at certain times of the year. Like, when does a daffodil grow? Spring.
Yeah.
However, if I took the bulbs out in spring and I put them in the fridge for 3 to 4 months and then took them back out, I can make them flower again in September. Because plants have built up cold units. You can trick plants into doing stuff. Urban farming will be wonderful when it really gets going, because it's energy efficient, solar powered, if efficient for water, and we have lots of hard surfaces here which we don't need to use stormwater drains when we could actually use it for growing food. Less pests and diseases is managed. It's in a general, I won't say sterile environment, but relative for pests and diseases purposes. And air miles, it just doesn't exist. So
you mentioned earlier you had a few living walls that were fed with rainwater harvesting.
We did,
which I think is a fantastic idea. And you always think, like, why isn't this the default that we use? You can also use rainwater for flushing toilets.
Absolutely.
And anything that doesn't need to be, potable, clean water.
Yep.
So it still boggles my mind that we don't do this on scale.
What we've done already with a hotel we installed last year is we collected all the grey water. We've cleaned it and stuck that into our irrigation tank instead. So that is when you've washed your hands in the sink, that water goes to our irrigation tank, and then we use that to feed the living wall as well. So that was a little bit of a trial because we weren't sure how it would play out. Bit of a risk. What we reckon is that the plants will just grow maybe a little bit bigger. So it might incur slight more maintenance because there will be more minerals in the soil. Now, it was on the cards this year, except this year turned head over tail. I was meant to approach a local grey water company near our office. So what I want to do is put 2 living walls up. One which would be just normal fresh water, just a squared meter would be sufficient, and the other would be only fed using grey water. We would see in terms of growth, so we'll have identical plants in identical positions, identical sizes starting. We would check, after a month, after 2 months, we could see if the plants improved, degrade. What we'd also like to do is then test the water. So as the water irrigates the living wall, when it comes to the gutter at the base, test that water and see if we're taking away any of that effective pollution from the water, so we can return cleaner water back at the drain. I'm
really impressed by how much testing and prototyping you do for these things.
Well, we are lucky. In Scotscape, there's about 4 ladies who work in the office who career-wise were more into finances, and there were but everyone else, every single person who works there is a gardener at heart. And I think that's the difference. So my job now is Mr. Business, and I'm in with architects and whatnot. And, I've made some massive deals in my time. But I've not grown up. I've not gone to business school or learnt any of this. I've learnt it all on the street. I've just learnt as we went along. And I just think it was our passion, the way we talk so passionately about what we believe in to be inherently true, that kind of drives all of this. Another huge benefit to us was the people who make our living wall system, Terapia Obama in Spain. And they're again, they're full of architects, engineers, ag science, horticulturists. We have doctors, all again hugely passionate against the built environment. So we can go to those guys. So we can say, hey, can we do tests on this or that or whatever? And they can help facilitate these tests.
Wow. Yeah.
So we're lucky to have such a good and positive relationship with Therapy. They're a wonderful company as well. And it is kind of tragic where, obviously I would never name names, but where other people can promote green living and green infrastructure, but maybe don't follow through on all their claims, as opposed to at least making an effort.
I think that's great. I mean, that's sort of backbone in the gardening and the horticulture, because we mentioned earlier before we were recording that trying to persuade and convince developers and architects to start bringing in green infrastructure is more about telling a story and the narrative rather than like the hard sell.
Yeah. Look, I get up and deliver my presentation to anyone who listens. The most common piece of feedback I would get was I didn't know. I didn't know. I gave a talk for Knight Frank here in central London. They get these guest speakers in for a morning CPD session, and they have all their managers and whatnot pile in. So I had about 50 to 60 people in the room, and then I had a few people via Skype and phoning it in and so on. They had a camera set up and broadcast their other offices. And one chap came up to me. He was quite senior with my Knight Frank, and he came with a big smile on his face at the end. And he came over and shook my hand. He goes, when he got into work that morning and he saw his calendar and he goes, he had to go to this green infrastructure talk. And he's like, oh God, I would do anything.
Some hippie's going to come in
and tell me. Start hugging a tree. And he said he dragged his heels up the corridor. He plonked his bum down. He knew he was getting like a burger or a bacon roll. So that kind of appeased him a little bit. And he shook my hand walking out. He goes, I never knew. And he was so happy. He said, you've really changed our perception of the way things should be, and like that's good as well. But when I think lots of people want to make all these positive changes, but they just say no. They just say no. It's just a plant's a plant. Or it's like, you could tell me something fascinating about some, I don't know, piece of concrete. And I go, it's same. I didn't know. I know. And like people are trying to make these wonderful changes. And it's just, again, it's getting that message out. Yeah. And I think it's great. Like, even like when you called me up to organise this podcast, I thought it was wonderful news. Not that we get to spread the message more, but it's more that the fact that the audience is there. It's like if they want it, it'll be produced and it'll be done and it's whatnot. And this is why we have these conversations, because then we can speak to a bigger audience and kind of go, oh wow, there is something we can do. And even if you did, and so many people do, live in an apartment which maybe have no access to green space. But you can actually we can look at it a little bit differently now, as opposed to beneficial plants and aesthetic plants. And there's nothing wrong with just having aesthetic plants. But when you know that there's a lot you can do, let's say for argument's sake, in your hanging baskets or if your window boxes, you could put in all the best plants for trap particulates. Yeah. And you could have some nice pretty flowers in your home, or, however you structure it. But every plant and everything we do will make a difference. Yeah. Regardless of how small or how trivial it's perceived at the time, if everyone did a little teeny tiny bit, you'd make a huge, huge change.
It has a real localized impact.
Yeah.
And maybe that's all you need. I mean, we're in my living room at the moment and I've got a lot of plants.
You do.
Mostly, I have to say, chosen based on their aesthetics, but we are sort of aware that some of them are good for air quality.
Absolutely. Your Boston fern.
Yeah.
So Dr. Bill Wolverton of NASA did a little experiment in the 80s. And there was a kind of a myth blown out of his experiment. So I might as well explain everything truthfully. He tested some plants. You've got some golden pathos, Dragacia, you have Maranta, you've got rubber plant. So what Dr. Bill Wolverton did was he put certain plants, he took the top 50 most popular house plants in America at the time. The reason he picked top 50 is all these plants had to be accessible to people.
Oh, yeah.
There's no point testing rare orchids from the middle of the jungle, which no one had access to. So we put these 50 houseplants in individual cases, pumped them full of certain chemicals, whether it was trichloroethylene, zetylene, formaldehyde, etc., etc. And he came back over a 24-hour period, and he's seen how many plants or how many micrograms per cubic meter that these plants remove of certain gases. So Biophilia, the peace lily, I might say these words and people go, huh? And if you saw a picture of it, you go, oh yeah, I know that one. So the peace lily has this kind of a little white bract. Just Google it. But that is one of the best air cleaning plants because it was able to remove a proportion of all these different gases. And this is kind of where the myth got born, because the myth kind of became, if I stick one of these plants in my living room, will I come back the next day and it's absorbed all of these gases? No. It will remove some of the gases because in the real world, there's too many variables. In the glass container, there is no variables. It's a certain gas, and it's forced to breathe in. When we open a window, open a door, we do anything, we change the proportion of gases present in the air.
So you've sort of mentioned a bit throughout the conversation that Scotscape has their own particular design of living wall, and all the components that go into it is sort of. Is that your own sort of trademark design?
Well,
or is there like an off-the-shelf living wall that you could get that is...
I'll explain it this way. Like anything, whatever you buy in life, you go to buy a new laptop, okay, and you put two of them side by side, and physically they may look similar, but what's important is what's inside and how they run the processors, etc., etc. People may look at a living wall, and they might think, well, living wall's a living wall. They're both the exact same. And I go, well, yeah, but they're not really. Not to say anything, I'm not going to comment on anyone else's system. I'm only going to comment on our own system. Like, we built our system about what's beneficial for the plant. And when you look, if you take our system apart component by component, it kind of all tells a story. And all living wall systems should be easy to construct. So they should be relatively easy. Boom, boom, boom. You can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 square meters on the wall that you don't need to be an absolute specialist to put it up. Just some common sense, be able to put it up.
So they're quite modular.
Yeah. And it should be logical to put up and logical to take down as well. It doesn't have to be overly complicated for being the sake of overly complicated. Irrigation systems. Living walls will require an irrigation system at some level. That irrigation system should be easy to install. Now, irrigation system will have a dripper. We're just going to drop the water out. So that's a moving part. All moving parts eventually have the potential to become stuck.
Yeah.
So a little bit of lime scale maybe got stuck in the dripper and it stops that. A good living wall system should allow you to easily access that dripper. So the living wall can physically stay on the wall. You should be able to take that irrigation line out, change what you need to change, put the irrigation system back in. Lots of living wall systems out there are solid plastics. And see, that actually prohibits airflow around the root system. See, airflow is really important around the root system. And ours is made of a nylon. It's a breathable nylon. If you held it up to the light, you can practically see through it. Or you can see shadows behind, certainly. That allows, airflow. It allows airflow around the root system. That promotes a stronger, healthier root because it doesn't allow the plants to become too soggy. What it also, now we haven't had this tested yet, but logic states it true. We can trap carbon at the root ball.
Okay.
So we can trap carbon by the leaves and it gets held by the plant itself, but we can also trap carbon in soil. So if we can get good gases exchange at the root ball, we should be able to trap more carbon there as well. Now, speaking of roots, we have a flexible fabric. The square meter has been the largest module. If we had a solid plastic system, the roots are restricted by the size of that pocket. By having this, flexible system, those roots can spread their way across the living wall module. So that's how we can host trees and large shrubs and whatnot. We're not restricted by a little teeny tiny pot. We can actually move. And
do they move outside the pocket?
We had a living wall down at our office, and we had privet in, and the privet sent roots down from one module and into the module below. Now, if we think about ecosystems, that's wonderful news, absolutely wonderful news, because it just reinforces the whole structure itself. There's a book called The Secret Life of Trees.
Yeah.
Did you read it?
I haven't read it yet. I think I have it on my Kindle. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. Well, anyone who's out there should read The Secret. I was fascinated. I couldn't believe what I was reading about how the forest floor and mycelium and all the roots. I know I knew about mycelium as such from being a gardener and whatnot. But when you actually see the relationship and you're going, wow, all of this happens around us on a day-to-day basis, I couldn't believe it. And if we can transfer that knowledge about how plants speak to each other, how they pass electrical impulses to each other, how mycelium can affect other plants. So you could have 3 plants in the sun, 1 in the shade. Those 3 plants in the sun can send energy over to the plant which is in the shade by help it to grow. Now, if it's the same family and relationship, etc., if they're different species, that probably wouldn't happen. If the plants are physically related, the plant will favour its relation over just the neighbouring plant. But anyway, so by even having these roots spread across, it's hugely beneficial as well. Even the structure of our material, it has the structure of the texture, I should say, of a for the want of a better description, it's like a scouring pad, like a Brillo pad. Okay. That's the texture. But again, be wonderful for trapping particulates. So where we use the leaf to trap particulates, we also think that the living wall material itself would trap, as opposed to a solid plastic system, which is shiny plastic. It's certainly going to bounce away. And they, for me, are probably the most important elements. Easy to construct, easy to maintain, and that the system itself looks after the plants in terms of roots, air movement, even the way the water can move around the system as well. So when people look at living walls, it's not always what you see on the outside, it's what happens inside as well, which can determine if it's a really good system or if it maybe looks the part but doesn't really hold true on all its claims.
That story you were saying about the plants sort of communicating and helping each other reminded me of a story I heard where scientists observed, I think it was giraffes, eating the leaves of a plant, and then they wouldn't. At some point, they would stop and they'd move on to another plant. Yeah, it was the same plant. They were just moving on to different specimens, sort of eating certain leaves. And they sort of looked at this and they thought, well, this is a bit strange. Why aren't they just staying in one plant, finishing it off? And what they discovered was happening was the plant sensed that it was being eaten, and then it sent kind of a mild kind of poison into the leaves. And then I think also it was transmitting the message to the other plants that were downwind to also release poison.
So what the giraffes did was they came in from the other side.
There you go.
And start eating from the other side. So even when they sent their chemical signals out, they're like, haha, you're not sending those to anyone who we want to eat. And giraffes had their way.
I'd love to wrap this up by just asking you, what is your sort of what would you like to see cities and urbanists doing differently over the next couple of decades? We're at quite a transitional point now where cities are realizing we have to move to carbon neutral. We have to start really seriously addressing climate change. From your perspective, what would you like to see being done?
Well, I think you've actually just said it there correctly. We have to take this serious. You get one planet. I don't want to swear on your podcast, but there's, a dog doesn't do something on his own doorstep. But we seem to do that to our own planet. And it's about one time, everything is, we think about the price of land and the economics behind all of these material items. We still have we have a finite planet. It's not inevitable that this is going to last forever. And we can see climate change happening. We can see the cost of living from heat island effect and so on. All the science is there. The evidence is there. Some people are willing to listen and try and pursue to help fix these problems. Other people want to maybe put their head in the sand because they make money from certain concepts or products or whatnot. What I would like to see is that people start to take this serious, that we look down and take a very logical stance and go, okay, this is how we would plan, this is how we can help do X, Y, and Z. I'm not saying the plants are going to fix everything. Plants can't fix everything. We have to reduce and think away about how we move ourselves, how transport works. Why do we spend so much money on shipping? Why are ships, 15 of the world's biggest ships, taking up the equivalent of all the sulfur dioxide produced in the world, as opposed to every other vehicle combined? And that's all because of our consumerism. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. I love going shopping as well as any person, and I would live a reasonably normal life. I just try to be conscious of everything which we would do, and just seeing where real value lies. Because once it's gone, it's very hard to get back.
Yeah, when you compare the greenhouse gas emissions of different countries, and people say, oh, well, Britain is only producing like 1%. And they said, but China and India are producing like these huge bits. It's like, that's because they're making all of our stuff over there.
There was an art exhibition in London, I think it was 2018. Yeah, I think it was in Trafalgar Square. They had 5 bubbles. And within these 5 bubbles, now this bubble would have been easily the size of your apartment. And with air from different countries. So air from Brazil, China, India, the UK, and then had a clean air bubble. There was actually one of them which wasn't allowed to open due to health and safety. Then I hazard a guess.
The Chinese bubble? No?
The London.
Really?
Yep. Even though you're outside breathing in London air, health and safety would not sign off on you to enter the London bubble.
Wow.
Because that's how bad air quality was. I said we like to blame everyone else.
Yeah.
We have to take responsibility as well.
Yeah.
You know, we all said someone else's problem. We need to actually, people start to get, you know what? It's my problem. You know, I live with this problem every day.
Yeah.
I've contributed to it. That's probably the one thing I'd like to change.
Personal responsibility.
Yeah, but that personal responsibility then it also affects big CEOs and managing directors and so on, right down to the local household on how we view everything. You know, personal responsibility.
Thank you so much for coming here, being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I've really enjoyed it. Where do you have any links or anything you'd like to share? Where can people find out more about you and Scotscape?
Well, again, Scotscape website is a great start. .co.uk. I do webinars generally about living wall, green infrastructure. I'll cover some of the topics we talked about today. I am going to write a new one. It will be the economics of green infrastructure. Great. So that's where, and it did almost be delivered in almost like part A, part B. So part A, you know, I've talked about air pollution, biophilia and biodiversity, and that ticks a lot of boxes. But there's some people who just ultimately don't care and they're just scared about the economics of everything. And we have to get everyone on board. So I think the next presentation, which I won't focus on one method, i.e. a living wall, a green roof and so on, but we'll just, as a blanket, as green infrastructure, how does that affect us economically and what are the positives? Because there are a huge amount of positives economically to installing green infrastructure.
Yeah.
So
can't afford not to.
They can't afford not to. So if anyone wants to listen to any of these, they can find me there at Scotscape. They can find me there on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to deliver those talks to anyone who will listen.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.